Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at Art Salon. My name is Chelsea Haines. I'm the Education and Public Programs Manager at Independent Curators International in New York. I'm joined today by the Bruce High Quality Foundation artist group, also based in New York, and Jens Hoffmann, curator based in San Francisco, where he's the director of the Wattis Institute for Contemporary Arts at the California College of the Arts. The topic of our conversation today is regionalism. And I thought it was really fascinating that our conversation was placed under the umbrella of the global art world. Because in my mind, these two terms, regionalism and globalism, are often talked about in diametric opposition to each other. So I'm glad that we have the chance to maybe talk about the intersecting relationship between the two, and also maybe our interest in talking about regionalism within an international art fair context. Just to give a really extremely brief layout and framework for the conversation, what I think we're attempting to do today is move towards a more critical understanding of regionalism through a discussion of contemporary creative practice and what it means to be an artist working and being educated in the United States today. For me, regionalism really doesn't have anything to do with stylistic tendency or actually even really geographic location, though of course they're connected in a lot of ways. For me, it's more about the centralization of the American art scene in terms of money, power, and normative aesthetics that are taught in MFA programs and then reinforced through commercial galleries, major museum exhibitions, etc. I would propose maybe two functional definitions of regionalism for our conversation. One is kind of a descriptive term, which would include artists and practitioners who are excluded or marginalized from the mainstream art world. And then perhaps a second, more productive term or definition of regionalism could be encompassing artists and practitioners who are thinking about ways and structures of challenging or resisting particular aspects of the mainstream art world. So in that way, regionalism can really act as a counter or a challenge to globalism, because of course globalism implies a sort of borderlessness that flattens out many contextual differences and is actually the antithesis of regionalism in a lot of ways. And so perhaps regionalism can also claim something like an interventionist tone in a critical dialogical sense, rather than just a marginalized, excluded sense, which is just not empowering at all. I don't really know if those definitions hold up with counter-arguments, but that's kind of the proposition for today in the next 30 minutes to talk about. So as you might have surmised, we're kind of taking a bit of a sideways angle towards understanding what regionalism in the United States is today. The Bruce High Quality Foundation will talk about the Teach for America project, and Jens will speak about People's Biennial, which is a traveling exhibition that he co-curated with the artist Harold Fletcher and is produced by ICI. So two very different projects, but both kinds of cross-country exploratory endeavors that really investigates a lot of issues that I just really briefly addressed. So I think we'll start with Teach for America, which was a nationwide brainstorming session on the future of the art school. So I'll let you take it from there.
The green button? Oh, good. Oh. So just to back up for one brief moment, Teach for America came out of a project that we started in 2009 called BHQFU, which for legal reasons doesn't mean the Bruce High Quality Foundation University, but for illegal reasons it does, which is a free, non-accredited art school that we founded in New York City September 11th, 2009. And basically our idea was that it's a self-organized model for how artists can start to learn from each other that stands outside of the sort of the BFA, MFA system that's widespread in the United States and obviously has a lot of influence in Europe and other places as well. So we were doing this where we got a space and we brought in a bunch of people, artists, anyone could come in and participate design their own classes, work together, and that was the basic setup for how it was running. We were doing this for about 18 months, and because we had to pay the rent, and the rent went up, we had to close the space, but we didn't want to stop the idea. So we pitched this project to Creative Time, a nonprofit in New York, called Teach for America with a K to differentiate it from Teach for America, the very legitimate teaching program that happens in the United States. And I have to say that for legal reasons as well. And our idea was to do research. This was the part of what a university is that we hadn't quite done as well, which was go out and find out what's going on. It's one thing to be running a school of some kind in New York City where there's a lot of people already there. There's already different kinds of communities to draw from. It's another thing to find out what's happening in the rest of the country. So we started with a vehicle, which is a school bus limousine. Our driver is here, Joe K, right over there, who took us on the road for a month, and we didn't get in any accidents except I think in New York actually trying to get out of the city was their only real accident. The setup was we were going to spend a month on the road visiting art schools, some museums, alternative spaces, just trying to get a gauge on what was happening. Everything was split into two parts. We would show up and we would give a lecture presentation on what we were interested in, which is why does art school cost so much money? Why does anyone think that's a good idea? And our idea for an alternative, which is based in New York. And then we would do another thing that was a smaller group where we asked students and faculty and people that were running spaces to come tell us what they were doing. So it was very sort of like AA meetings. We all sat in a circle. They told us what was going on. We said thank you, and then we got back in the school bus and drove to the next Denny's. So we started in New York, and we had a T-shirt cannon. That was useful too. We had marching bands in every city that would sort of introduce the whole thing. The idea was to kind of build a sort of ridiculous level of excitement around the idea of an alternative approach to arts education. So that's what it looked like in Philadelphia. There she is. It's all over the country. This is sort of what the conversations would look like when we would get people together to talk about alternative approaches to like what they were doing in their own city, to think about different ways that artists could learn that wouldn't put them all into debt. Just quickly on the subject of regionalism, the thing that really came out for us was that, as I think you could expect, a lot of art schools in the sort of mainline system really look to New York and LA and maybe Chicago, but not really, as this is the echelon of what they're going to achieve. And it's whether they say this directly in their curriculum or not, that ends up being the way that a lot of young artists see what they're supposed to be doing. They think, I'm going to go to art school and I'm going to go into $100,000 of debt. I'm in Kansas or I'm wherever else, and then I'm going to move to an art center, and because I'm so great, I'm going to make all that money back. And our point was to say, no, you're not. It's just not possible. There's thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people going through this system, and it's somewhat unjustifiable. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be getting an education, but we might need to think about new ways of doing it, new ways of conceiving of it, because it's just not going to work. It doesn't work for many people who already live in those centers, and you're going to have a harder time doing what you want if you've got massive amounts of debt getting in the way for the rest of your life. But there were a few schools that were actually doing things that were to some extent exceptional. One of them was in, surprisingly enough, Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. A guy named John Rubin was running a program, you probably know John, called Contextual Practices is I think the name of it. And he did something that we thought was really interesting called the Waffle Shop, where he was basically funneling money out of Carnegie Mellon to start an independent operation, which in this case was an actual waffle shop. You could go and get waffles and ice cream. And it also functioned as a radio station, as a place for artists to have meetings, to talk, and to actually hold their classes there. And the way that he was designing it was to take a little bit of seed money from the university and move it into this independent business in the city of Pittsburgh itself, and eventually have it fund itself. So it could become a completely independent operation that still had an educational component to it and was actually something that interacted directly with the city. So the conversation about regionalism was very appropriate there, because the whole idea of contextual practices was you don't always have to be focused on the idea that your work is going into a gallery, that an artist could be integrated into a different kind of community more locally and actually be dealing with like the real economics of what that situation is. It's like, why a waffle shop? Because there's enough people in that part of Pittsburgh that would actually want to eat waffles for whatever reason. They were good waffles though. Pumpkin. I had a pumpkin waffle.
Delicious waffles.
They were really good. Another one was actually in Portland with Harold Fletcher. He was running a program with a very similar sounding title. I'm sure you remember whatever the name of his program is. It's something like Contextual Practices. It's a graduate program, MFA. You still have to pay money, but they don't have studios, and the entire focus is that you're doing a thesis project for the time you're there that's actually meant to happen, where you are. So a lot of the things of projects are happening in Portland and sort of built around that site. Some of them are happening other places, and they're just coming there to actually talk through them. But very heavily focused on the idea that artists need to start working within the economies of people and economies of money of the actual cities that they live in, and not necessarily be focused on a very sort of mainstream notion of what commercial success would be. So those are two really interesting examples. A third that's a little stranger, in some ways even more exciting, was in Detroit, where they don't have any money. There's this really expensive art school there, which is really strange. It's mostly focused on design and industrial design and animation, but there is an art school part of it. Really fancy, expensive facilities, and then you walk outside the gate and you're in Detroit, where there's a bunch of empty buildings, and no one knows what to do to make any kind of economy function. But there are a handful of nonprofit and not even in any way legally set up organizations like Detroit Soup. There was a group called 5E, which was sort of a hip-hop collective that we met, and they were fantastic. We were doing educational programs, working with local artists, working with the communities that they're actually in. And those things actually felt like they made much more sense, because they were these are the people that actually knew what was going on in Detroit. They weren't asking us a lot of questions about how do you get a gallery in New York and things like that, which is honestly the real answer is I have no clue. And they were telling us things about how the economy actually worked in Detroit, what kind of grants existed for artists there, if any at all, and what were some options for way artists could work in those places. So I guess that's kind of the overview.
Yeah. What's kind of interesting with what you're saying is that you're basically tracing the development of an economic model for artistic practice that goes from object or commodity production to a service industry, which is actually very much in line with how our economy is functioning today. I don't know if that actually...
No, that's an interesting idea. I mean, I don't know if they ended up making very much money in the service industry either, but no, it's true. I mean, that's very much it. That they're when it comes to material products, industrial, if that's the equivalent of making a painting, then a shift toward a service economy is kind of what anyone has to do as soon as the quantities are filled up from industry.
Right, exactly. And what was the reaction, generally speaking? I know you talked about these 3 case studies, but when you went into maybe more traditional MFA programs or BFA programs, sort of, what were the response from the students and the faculty to your project?
There were a few different kinds of responses. I mean, obviously, when you go into a school and have a marching band and then give an hour-long presentation about why everyone there should quit school and stop paying their student loans. Yeah. Some people don't like that. For students, some of them it's very easy, and they're like, well, yeah, obviously this is what we should do. If you're a tenured faculty member, we definitely got some heated responses and had some interesting arguments about that. But most of the time it came down to, well, if suddenly, which seems very unlikely, if suddenly tomorrow we eradicate the idea of a $100,000 arts education, I'm just using that number as a reference because that's about what mine was supposed to cost, then you're dealing with a situation where you've got faculty members who have jobs, and there's nothing to say. It's not to say that their work isn't valuable, but suddenly you're going to lose a lot of jobs.
Right.
And part of our argument was that it's kind of a backwards way to be thinking about what an arts education is we shouldn't be thinking about it from the point of view of supporting an industry. We should be thinking about it in terms of what, to be honest, what the tradition of a more liberal arts education is based on, creating a more free, democratic society,
Mm-hmm.
and sort of let the chips fall where they may when it comes to how people make money.
Mm-hmm. What I think is interesting about both of your projects is sort of this process of open call, or the sort of dialogical process that took place throughout sort of researching phase. And maybe we can talk later about what this project might turn into, but maybe Jens, you want to talk a little bit about People's Biennial and its inception and actualization.
Yeah. Let me see. I think we have to change the slides. So let me take that moment to just wait. Okay, so as Chelsea already mentioned, the People's Biennial took place within the framework of Independent Curator International, which is an organization based in New York that has been around for how many years?
36.
36 years. And for most of the history, ICI has organized traveling exhibitions of contemporary art that travel throughout the United States, which is a very interesting concept to think of an organization that actually organizes in New York exhibitions without having a space that then toured various museums in the country, but actually never seen in the city where this organization is based. Several years ago, ICI approached me if I was interested in coming up with a project for them. At that point, I didn't really have an idea. And then a number of things came together. On the one hand, I was reading Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States, which is a book that looks at the history of America from the point of the marginalized, the disenfranchised, if you will, and really looking at aspects of its history that have been so far, either erased or been overlooked. So this idea of erasing, overlooking, was something that was very important to the People's Biennial. And then Chelsea mentioned in the beginning these two ideas, or two ways of defining regionalism, of which I think both are sort of, both are very complementary to each other, actually. So this idea that regionalism would actually be looking what is the difference between the center and the periphery, or something that is mainstream and something that is marginalized. What we did was to think about what is sort of the most prevalent exhibition model these days. And obviously biennials have proliferated all over the world. So we sort of ironically thinking that this could be an interesting way of forming our show, which means a large-scale overview show. And similarly to the Whitney Biennial, we picked one geographic region, which was the United States, and within that we selected 5 different cities through which where we would go and conduct research for a period of a week, and then select a number of artists to participate in an exhibition that would then travel to those cities. And these cities were Portland, Oregon, Scottsdale, Arizona, Rapid City, South Dakota, Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Haverford in Pennsylvania. Right now the show is on view at Scottsdale. It's a Scottsdale Museum of Contemporary Art, and the next stop is going to be in Haverford College near Philadelphia. These are the participating artists. And what was important to us, of course, was this idea of looking for artists that somehow, for various reasons, are not participating in the mainstream art world, or are not representing that particular structure. So it also goes back to this idea of education. There are some artists in this project that have MFAs or BFAs or other sort of art degrees, but by and large, that wasn't really necessarily the way that they, reached us. What happened was that we went on tour. This is me in Portland, Oregon, doing a studio visit there. Here I'm trying to stop a lady that made quilts that we ran into by chance. Jane, the quilt maker. This is Harold and me giving a talk about our project. So in each city, we would start by giving a presentation of what Harold and I were doing in our practice as artists and curators. This is us in South Dakota, looking at street art, here in Scottsdale, Arizona. So when we were doing these presentations of our own work, we would also present the idea of the People's Biennial. And in many cases, there was quite a lot of resistance to this. Here is Harold in Pennsylvania, me and Harold in Winston-Salem. So what we did was we had open calls in each of those cities, and artists came and presented us their work. Those were mostly artists who came to the talk, so I had heard about this in the newspaper or through emails that were sent out by the curators who were working in the museums that would host this exhibition. I think one of the important aspects of this show was that no matter where the show went to, it always had a local component to it. There was always a group of like 8 artists from each of those places that would be local. So, you had 8 artists from Rapid City or 8 artists from Portland and so on and so forth, which is kind of very unusual for a traveling exhibition. Usually you have traveling exhibitions going from one place to the other, but often without much relation to the context in which they're exhibited and presented. So in this case, we somehow found a way of making each of those stations also connect very closely to the local audience. So these are these open calls. People had like a room like this where people had tables and they would bring in their artwork, and Harold and I would spend 2 days looking at like the work of maybe 100 artists in each of those cities, and out of those 100 artists we would then ultimately invite between 6 and 10 to participate in this exhibition. And there's a really wide range of artworks there. It was very hard for us to sort of like really be able to define what it was we were looking for, but we were also resisting to define what we were looking for. Some people called it amateur art, some people called it outsider art, but it was, a little bit of all of those things, I suppose. This is in Rapid City. Just a couple of clips from the open calls. This is also from South Dakota, some of the artists there. So the first exhibition was in Portland with the ICA there as part of the festival that they do every year. The exhibition was presented in an old high school, in a former high school, which was a really nice and interesting venue to begin this exhibition. And here you see some of the works. Then we went to the Dahl Center in Rapid City, which is more like an institutional type of space, but rather awkward because it had round walls and was almost like people building a museum who had never been to a museum before. Everything was sort of not really fitting the way it fits in another museum, which was kind of interesting for us also to having to adapt to a situation like this. And most of the sort of like whole administrative negotiations with particularly this institution was just similarly off like the room was. It's sort of almost a metaphor there. This is the mutant piñatas that were coming from Scottsdale. This is in Winston-Salem, which was the largest venue, and where it really became sort of like had a really an institutional feel. And then Smoker, which was the last venue where the exhibition is still on view. Oh yeah, here's a close-up of one of the mutant piñatas. Bernie Peterson, he is from Scottsdale. He makes soap carvings. Bob Newland, a rodeo photographer from Scottsdale. This is a very interesting project here, the Judge Evans and the Portland Community Court. Judge Evans runs a community court, which is like a small court for people who do theft and burglary. And the judge was offering the convicts, whether they had to spend, do social service, go to jail for a couple of days, or make an artwork reflecting on their crime. Many of them actually made works, sort of reflections on their crime, and then he would present those in the courtroom. So Alai Dross, who is an artist in Portland, got to know about this project and asked the judge if she could make a selection of these artworks from the criminals and present this as part of the People's Biennial. Here's just a couple of more examples of the work. And the final stop of the People's Biennial is going to be in Haverford, where the show will open in about a month.
Do you think that the exhibition changed, or maybe if the local curators perhaps rethought their relationship to community and artists and artwork in different ways?
The show changed from venue to venue, but it was also not necessarily because of the curators, but also because of the space, because of the city it was in. I think the furthest away that we really were from the mainstream art world, not only geographically, but also artistically or intellectually or economically, was Rapid City. And for me personally, that was the richest experience of the tour. To go there, to see that place, which is economically completely depressed. We went on an Indian reservation there, where they have like an unemployment rate of 99.5%. Basically 100% unemployment, and like 86% high school dropout rate. And some of the pictures that you saw there were actually made on the reservation. But a lot of young people making work there that we got to know.
How much time do we have left? Because I have a couple questions.
Over time.
But 5 minutes. Does anybody in the audience have questions? Otherwise, I will ask one. Yeah.
I want to hear more Juan Ruiz Healy. I'm a journalist. I want to hear more about the Bruce Foundation. Mm-hmm. What's it all about? Give us more information.
Oh.
Please, thank you.
Let's see. We have 5 minutes, you said?
Well, you guys do this afterwards, the two of you, and then we just talk a little bit more about the regionalism subject. Yeah. Is that okay? We're just so short on time, But I know that he's going to talk for an hour about the Bruce High Quality Foundation, or even longer.
Okay. Yeah.
That's okay. No?
Hi, I'm Claire Schneider. I'm an independent curator. I guess my question is this question of marginalization and people from the center and the periphery and power and not power. It's interesting that this topic here, there's nobody from those places discussing it. It's people from the center talking about the periphery. I just love to hear, the people promoting this discussion are coming from a place of power versus the other way around.
Yeah, and that was very similar to kind of the question that I was going to ask both of you. And I mentioned earlier on that we were taking a very sideways angle towards the definition of regionalism, because we aren't asking people who work for institutions in Kansas to come and talk. But I think that there's a really interesting perspective that can be developed from being an outsider and kind of bringing ideas in, and that kind of conversation that can take place that I think happened with both of your projects. And so I don't know if you want to talk about more any of like the conflicts or the conversations that happened as, sort of you understanding your power dynamic and having like one foot deeply entrenched in the art world and then one foot kind of, exploring these other projects, and what kind of dynamic that can have.
Well, I think from, is this thing still working?
I think so.
Hello? Yeah. I think from our point of view, we didn't really want to recognize that it was a power dynamic where there is this center of the art world, and then there's all this other stuff that's marginal, and which is largely how people feel about it. but our interest was actually to go to places where, we're marginal. It's like they didn't know who we were necessarily, and a lot of the things that would make sense to us about how to deal with art and how to work with it is something that only makes sense in art centers. It makes sense in New York, it makes sense in Paris and London, it makes sense in Berlin to an extent, but it doesn't make sense in Kansas. It's like, so what does make sense there? We didn't go to Kansas, but as an example, it's right in the middle. And also, the whole notion that you're a successful artist if you're making a lot of money and living in New York, which I'm living in New York but not making a lot of money, this is what sort of gets people on the wrong track anyway. And what was interesting to us was to see these programs, the few examples that we're doing something to actually say that it's not marginal to be working in Pittsburgh or to be working in Portland. It's different. And those things don't necessarily need to have the same kind of attention globally that something in New York might need. But it's equally valid, and the people working in those environments should recognize it. Like, that is success in its own way. And how we try to value success as artists is not about a certain kind of like global attention, but more about how we feel like a project is received by its audience, whether that audience is global or it's just the people right in front of you. And that's the kind of message we were trying to talk to students who are struggling with that. If they're going to school somewhere in the middle of the country and thinking that success means getting to New York, we wanted to encourage them to think that no, it doesn't. It can mean a different kind of success that can be very local. Is that an answer?
You want to address that?
Is there another question?
Hello, my name is Candace O'Brien. You had mentioned that along this whole journey you had continually met with resistance, and I would like it if you could address that a little bit more.
Yeah, there were different points of criticism. One of them was that this was basically sort of like a project that Harold and I organized to illustrate a particular concept in regards to the dichotomy between center and periphery, for example. And I think what was very interesting in places that you would perhaps sort of identify as relative periphery, like Scottsdale, which is very close to Phoenix, or Haverford, which is very close to Philadelphia, where there is actually a professional art scene, quote unquote, where people say, well, the Whitney Biennial Curators didn't come to see us or didn't come to see what we do, and now you guys also don't kind of come to see what we do because for you we are too mainstream and for the other ones we are too alternative. So there was that sort of conflict that came up several times as well. So those were, I think, like the two main criticisms. And another one was similarly to that, like, okay, you're coming from places of power, and you're not actually really one of them. Obviously, that's probably a little bit more complex, I see myself as someone who actually works in the periphery in San Francisco, having lived in London before, and particularly in San Francisco, choosing to work within an art school rather than working at a mainstream museum, but consciously doing this as an act of trying to move away from these particular structures of power that you might sort of associate with New York, for example, or maybe Los Angeles. All right, thanks to all of you for coming.
I think there was one more question, no?
Yes.
Well, I thought we were running out of time.
We're out of time. Okay, we're out of time. Well, thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Thank you.
And thank you, everybody, for coming. And thanks to Art Basel.
Thanks to